Come and sit a while. The sun's getting low, and the desert's about to start telling its secrets. The stories they tell about this land are usually about the hunters, lawmen, the bounty men, the outlaws, men who live by the gun and by the chase. But they forget that for every hunter, there's the hunted. And sometimes the hunted learns the hunter's game better than he ever did. This is a story about a woman like that. A woman who was supposed to be a victim, a footnote in a bloody tale. But she refused to be broken. She picked up the gun that fell from her husband's hand, and she became the one thing the predators never saw coming, a hunter of the men who hunt. Alright, the wind's got a story on its breath. Let's travel to the red rock country of New Mexico, and follow the trail of a woman who refused to be the prey. The year 1892 was a time when the West was supposedly being tamed, but in the vast, sun-scorched plains of New Mexico, the only law that truly mattered was the law of the predator and the prey. Clara Dawson had always known this, but she had been content and privileged to live on the safe side of that brutal equation. She was the wife of Ben Dawson, one of the most respected and feared bounty hunters in the territory. Ben was not a killer. He was a man of quiet integrity and preternatural skill, known for his relentless tracking abilities and his preference for bringing men back alive to face a judge. He was a force of order in a chaotic world. Clara was his anchor, his sanctuary. Their small, well-kept home on the outskirts of the town of Willow Creek was a world away from the violence and dust of his profession. It was a place of warmth, of books, of a shared deep and quiet love. Clara was not a frontierswoman in the traditional sense. She was a woman of gentle temperament and quiet intelligence, her strength lying not in her hand, but in her heart. This peaceful, ordered world was shattered by a gang known as the Iron Spurs. They were a new and particularly vicious breed of outlaw, led by a man named Marcus Thorne, man who had once ridden with Ben before a bitter, violent falling out over a question of honor. The Iron Spurs were not just robbers, they were butchers, known for their cruelty and for leaving no witnesses. Ben had been on their trail for weeks, a federal warrant for Thorne in his pocket. He was close. Too close. Thorne, a man who knew Ben's methods, his mind, his very soul, did not wait to be hunted. He became the hunter. He and his gang laid a trap, a perfect, brutal ambush in a narrow canyon. Ben Dawson, the man who had brought in 100 outlaws, was cut down in a hail of rifle fire, his last stand a testament to a courage that was ultimately no match for a traitor's bullet. The news of his death hit Willow Creek like a physical blow. The town's protector was gone. The official investigation, conducted by a timid, ineffectual town marshal, was a sham. The Iron Spurs were ghosts, the witnesses too terrified to speak. Ben Dawson was just another good man dead in a land that had a surplus of them. Clara's grief was a vast, silent, and bottomless thing. The townspeople offered their pity, their platitudes, their casseroles. They expected her to mourn, to sell her home, to fade away into the quiet, respectable obscurity of widowhood. They saw a broken woman, a ship without a rudder, a victim of the West's casual brutality. They did not see the fire that was being kindled in the depths of her soul. They did not see the woman who sat up late into the night, not weeping, but meticulously cleaning her husband's guns, the tools of his trade. They did not see the woman who was poring over his maps, his notes, his journals, absorbing his knowledge, his tactics, his very essence. For a month, she played the part of the grieving widow. Then, one night, she was gone. She sold her house to the town doctor for a pittance, packed a single saddlebag with her husband's guns, his maps, and a small, cherished tintype of the two of them, and she rode out of Willow Creek. Not east, toward the safety of civilization, but west, deeper into the harsh and forgiving wilderness. The town assumed she had gone mad with grief, that she was riding out into the desert to die. They were half right. The woman they had known, Clara Dawson, the gentle wife, was already dead. The person who rode into the desert was someone new, a creature of pure, cold, and unwavering purpose. She was not riding to her death. She was riding to her education. She was on a quest to learn the hunter's trade, so that she, in turn, could become the hunter of the men who had taken her world from her. The desert became Clara's university, and its curriculum was the brutal and forgiving science of survival. The first few months were a litany of hardships that would have broken a soul not forged in the crucible of her grief. She was a town woman, and the wilderness was an alien and hostile world. She learned the hard way about the false promise of a dry creek bed, the subtle signs of a hidden spring, the difference between the track of a deer and the track of a wolf. She learned the deep, soul-crushing loneliness of the trail, a silence that was a constant, mocking echo of the life she had lost. But she was not just a survivor, she was a student. She carried with her her husband's journals, a detailed, handwritten encyclopedia of his life's work. In them, he had not just recorded his bounties, he had detailed his methods. He had written about tracking, about the psychology of the men he hunted, about how to read the land, how to set a cold camp, how to live and move and think like a ghost. At night, by the light of a small, smokeless fire, she did not read books of poetry. She studied the art of the manhunt, her husband's voice a quiet, guiding presence in the vast, empty darkness. Her education, however, was not just theoretical. She sought out the masters of the craft, the forgotten men who lived on the fringes of the world. She used the last of her money not to buy comfort, but to buy knowledge. She found an old, grizzled ex-cavalry scout, a man who had been cast out by the army he had served, and she paid him to teach her the art of the ambush, of tactics, of how to think like a soldier. She spent a month with a small, nomadic band of Jicarilla Apache, not as a captive, but as a student. She learned their silent language of the earth, their methods of moving without a trace, their profound and intimate understanding of the desert's harsh and beautiful soul. And, most importantly, she learned to shoot. She was not a natural. Her hands were not the hands of a gunfighter. But she possessed something more potent than natural talent, an obsessive, unwavering, and almost terrifying will. She would spend entire days practicing with her husband's heavy Colt and his Winchester, firing until her shoulder was a mass of bruises, until her hands were raw and bleeding, until the movements of drawing, aiming, firing, and reloading were no longer a conscious thought, but a fluid, instinctive part of her very being. She was not just learning to be a hunter, she was transforming. The soft lines of the townswoman were being burned away by the sun and the wind, replaced by the hard, lean lines of a survivor. The grief in her eyes, while still present, was now banked by a cold, hard, and dangerous fire. She was no longer just a widow. She was a weapon, being forged and tempered in the harshest of elements. After a year of this self-imposed, brutal education, she was ready. She was no longer a student. She was a graduate of the University of Vengeance. She began her hunt. Her targets were not the leaders of the Iron Spurs, not yet. Her targets were the outliers, the lesser members of the gang, the men on the fringes. She was not just seeking revenge, she was gathering intelligence. With each man she hunted, she learned more about the gang structure, their habits, their plans. She did not kill them, not at first. Her husband had been a man who brought his bounties back alive, and a part of her still clung to his code. She would track them, ambush them, and disarm them with a shocking, terrifying efficiency. She would tie them up and leave them for the local law, along with an anonymous note detailing their crimes. She was becoming a ghost, a legend. Stories began to circulate through the territory of a phantom hunter, a widow angel, who was preying on the predators, a force of justice as mysterious and as unstoppable as a desert storm. The men of the Iron Spurs, who had laughed at the death of the great Ben Dawson, now found themselves looking over their shoulders, their arrogant confidence eroding into a quiet, gnawing fear. They were the hunters, but for the first time in their violent lives, they were now being hunted, and their hunter was the ghost of the woman they had so casually, and so foolishly, broken. Claire's one woman war against the Iron Spurs was brutally effective, but she knew it was not sustainable. She was a ghost, but she was a solitary one, and the gang, though wounded and paranoid, was still a powerful and numerous pack. To take down the leader, Marcus Thorne, and the core of his operation, she would need more than just her own skill and determination. She would need an army, and an army, in this lawless land, was a difficult thing to raise. She did not seek out heroes or lawmen. She sought out the damned. She sought out the other victims of the Iron Spurs' reign of terror, the men who, like her, had been broken by the gang and were now simmering in their own private hells of grief and a desire for payback. She would not offer them justice or honor. She would offer them the one thing they all craved, a chance at revenge. Her first recruit was a man named Silas, a former Confederate soldier who had lost an arm at Gettysburg and now lived as a prospector. The Iron Spurs had jumped his claim, beaten him half to death, and stolen the small fortune in gold he had spent a year digging from the earth. He was a man consumed by a quiet, burning hatred, his missing arm a constant, physical reminder of his humiliation. He was also a brilliant tactician, an expert in explosives, and a man who knew the mountains like the back of his one remaining hand. Her second ally was a young, disgraced deputy from a neighboring county named James. Thorne and his gang had ridden through his town, had killed his sheriff in a brazen shootout, and had made him look like a helpless fool. He had been stripped of his badge, and now lived as a wandering, embittered cowboy, his name a joke, his honor in tatters. He was a fast gun, and he was desperate for a chance to reclaim his self-respect. Her third, and most surprising, recruit was the sheriff of Willow Creek itself, a man named Henderson. Henderson was not a brave man. He was the timid, ineffectual lawman who had conducted the sham investigation into Ben's murder. But he was a man with a conscience, and it had been eating him alive. He was trapped, a puppet of the Iron Spurs, forced to turn a blind eye to their crimes, his badge a symbol of his own shame. Clara did not threaten him. She did not try to intimidate him. She offered him a chance at redemption. She would be the sword of the resistance, but she needed him to be its shield, to be their source of inside information, to be the law and secret that he had failed to be in public. This small, ragged group named Soldier, the disgraced lawman, the compromised sheriff, and the avenging widow became the core of the resistance. They were not an army of heroes. They were an army of the damned, a collection of broken souls united by a shared, burning desire to settle a score. Their headquarters was a series of hidden, interconnected caves in the high mesas, a place that Silas, the prospector, knew from his years of searching for gold. From this secret sanctuary, they began to wage a new, more organized, and far more deadly war. They were a perfectly balanced team. Silas was the strategist, the planner, his mind as explosive and as precise as the dynamite he so expertly handled. James was the muscle, the fast gun, the man they sent in when a direct, violent confrontation was unavoidable. Henderson was the spy, their eyes and ears inside the corrupt system, feeding them information about the gang's movements, their plans, and their weaknesses. And Clara was the heart, the soul, and the leader. She was the one who held them together, her own pure, unwavering purpose, the forge in which their disparate desires for revenge were hammered into a single, deadly weapon. She was no longer just a hunter. She was a general, commanding a small, desperate army in a war that no one else was willing to fight. Their first major operation was a direct assault on the source of the Iron Spurs' power, their stolen gold. They learned from Henderson that Thorne was planning to move a massive shipment of gold, the combined spoils of a half-dozen robberies, by a heavily guarded wagon train, on its way to be laundered through a corrupt bank in Santa Fe. The plan for the ambush was Clara's masterpiece, a synthesis of everything she had learned. It was a combination of Apache stealth, military tactics, and her own unique and deeply personal brand of psychological warfare. They would not just rob the wagon train. They would dismantle it, humiliate it, and turn the gang's greatest asset into their greatest liability. The stage for this confrontation was a place of red rock and long shadows, a place known as Mesa Roja. Mesa Roja was a place of stark, brutal beauty, a landscape of towering, blood-red rock formations and deep, shadowy canyons. It was a natural fortress and a perfect death trap. The main trail to Santa Fe cut directly through a narrow pass at its center, a place where a dozen rifles could hold off an army. It was here that Clara and her small army of the damned chose to make their stand. The plan for the ambush was a testament to the unique and deadly combination of skills her group possessed. It was a three-act play of violence and misdirection, and Clara was its director. Act 1 belonged to Silas, the one-armed demolitions expert. For 2 days prior to the wagon train's arrival, he and a small team worked with a feverish, silent intensity. They did not mine the pass with dynamite, which would have been the obvious, predictable move. Instead, they mined the cliffs above the pass. Silas, with his intimate knowledge of geology, identified the key and stable sections of the rock face. They spent hours drilling, planting small, precisely located charges, all connected by a single, long fuse that ran to a hidden command post high on the mesa rim. Act 2 was the illusion. Clara knew that Thorne, a cautious and paranoid man, would send a group of scouts ahead of the main wagon train. To deal with them, she employed the tactics of the Apache. Her men, their faces painted with mud and ash, created a series of small, smoky fires on the surrounding mesas, giving the impression of a much larger force. They used mirrors to flash signals, a confusing and readable language that would fray the nerves of the scouts. And they created a ghost trail, the tracks of 24 horses where there were only a few, leading the scouts on a wild, fruitless chase into a dead-end canyon, miles away from the real ambush site. Act 3 was the trap itself. The wagon train, carrying 5 heavily armed guards and a fortune in stolen gold, rumbled into the pass, its scouts having been successfully drawn away. The pass was silent, seemingly deserted. The guards, their initial tension having eased, grew careless. As the wagon reached the exact center of the pass, Clara, from her vantage point high on the rim, gave the signal. Silas lit the fuse. The world did not erupt in a single, massive explosion. Instead, it came apart in a rolling, thunderous cascade. The precisely placed charges detonated in sequence, not with a boom, but with a deep, grinding crack. The cliffs on both sides of the pass seemed to groan, to shift, and then to disintegrate. A massive rock slide, a literal avalanche of red rock and dust, roared down into the pass. It was not designed to kill the guards. It was designed to entomb them. The rock slide blocked the pass both in front of and behind the wagon, trapping it in a dusty, rock-choked prison. The guards, stunned, deafened, and disoriented, stumbled from the wagon, their rifles at the ready, peering into the thick, whirling cloud of red dust. And from that dust, the ghosts emerged. Clara, James, and the rest of their fighters descended from the cliffs, their faces covered with bandanas, silent, menacing figures appearing from the haze. They did not open fire. They simply surrounded the trapped and terrified guards. "The gold is ours," Clara's voice said, calm and clear, seeming to come from the dust itself. "Your lives are your own. The choice is simple. Drop your guns and walk away, or die here and be buried with it." The guards, their nerve broken, their situation hopeless, made the only choice they could. They dropped their guns. Clara and her men did not take all the gold. They took a portion of it, enough to fund their war, to buy supplies, to continue their fight. The rest of it, they left in the wagon, a tantalizing and reachable prize, buried under 100 tons of rock. They left a message for Thorne, painted in crude letters on the side of the wagon, "A debt is paid." Then, they melted back into the wilderness, leaving the 5 disarmed, humiliated guards to make the long, shame-faced walk back to their master. The Mesa Roja ambush was a stunning, devastating victory. It was not just a robbery, it was a strategic and psychological masterstroke. Clara had not just stolen Thorne's gold, she had stolen his mystique. She had proven that he was not invincible. She had proven that his heavily armed, professional force could be defeated by a small, intelligent, and fiercely determined group of rebels. The news of the ambush spread through the territory like a prairie fire. It was a story of hope, a legend in the making. The widow of Willow Creek was no longer just a ghost, she was a leader, a symbol of resistance. And the men who had once been the hunters, the feared Iron Spurs, were now the hunted, their own fear a palpable, corrosive thing. Thorne, when he received the news, did not fly into a rage. He fell into a cold, silent, and far more dangerous fury. The game was no longer about gold. It was personal. And he would not rest until the woman who had so brilliantly humiliated him was dead. The aftermath of the Mesa Roja ambush was a period of tense, watchful silence. Clara and her small army had retreated to their mountain fortress, the stolen gold providing them with the resources they needed to sustain a longer, more protracted war. But Clara knew they had not won. They had merely wounded the beast. And a wounded beast is the most dangerous kind. Marcus Thorne was a man unaccustomed to defeat. The loss of his gold, and the public humiliation of the ambush, had been a devastating blow to his authority. His men, who had once followed him with a mixture of fear and respect, were now looking at him with a new, dangerous emotion, doubt. He knew he had to strike back, and he had to do it in a way that would not just defeat the rebels, but utterly and completely crush their spirit. His response was not a direct military assault. It was an act of cold, calculated, and deeply personal cruelty. He knew he could not find Clara in the mountains. So, he decided to draw her out. He decided to take the war to the one place he knew she still held a connection, the town of Willow Creek. He and a dozen of his most ruthless riders descended on the small, peaceful town like a plague. They were not there to rob or to pillage. They were there to deliver a message written in fear. They rounded up a half-dozen of the town's leading citizens, doctor, the preacher, the blacksmith, men who had been friends of Ben and Clara Dawson. They did not harm them. They simply held them hostage in the town's small church. The message was sent to Clara via a terrified, captured farmer. Thorne would trade the hostages. His price was not gold. His price was Clara herself. She was to come to Willow Creek, alone and unarmed, and surrender herself to him. If she refused, or if any attempt at a rescue was made, he would begin to execute the hostages, one every hour, starting at dawn. The news hit Clara's mountain camp like a physical blow. It was a devil's bargain, an impossible choice. She had spent a year detaching herself from her old life, from the woman she had been. She had become a creature of vengeance, her heart shielded by a wall of cold, hard purpose. But Thorne, with his devil's cunning, had found the one remaining crack in that wall, her conscience. She had started this war to avenge a good man. She could not allow it to be the cause of the deaths of other good, innocent people. Her men Silas, James, and the others were unanimous. "It's a trap," James said, his face a grim mask. "The moment you show yourself, he'll kill you. And he'll probably kill the hostages anyway." "He's right," Silas added, his one good hand clenching and unclenching. "This is not your fight to bear alone. We ride with you. We go into that town and we tear it apart." Clara listened, her face pale, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. A part of her, the cold, pragmatic strategist, knew they were right. A direct confrontation was suicide. But the other part of her, the part that was still Ben Dawson's wife, the part that still remembered the kindness of these men who were now facing death because of her, could not accept that logic. "This is not a strategic problem," she said, her voice a low, pained whisper. "This is a question of honor. My husband, he lived by a code. He never, ever, left a man behind. And he never, ever, allowed an innocent to pay the price for his fight. I will not be the one to betray that code." She knew what she had to do. She would go. She would walk into Thorne's trap. But she would not go as a victim. She would go as a hunter, one last time. She made her preparations, not for a surrender, but for a final, desperate battle. She confided her true plan to only one person, James, the disgraced deputy, the man who understood the intricate and often brutal dance between the law and the lawless. She would accept Thorne's terms. She would ride into Willow Creek at dawn, alone and unarmed, but James and Silas, with the rest of their small force, would not be riding with her. They would be moving under the cover of darkness, taking up hidden, strategic positions, turning the entire town of Willow Creek into a giant, coordinated ambush site. It was a plan of almost suicidal risk. It depended on Thorne's arrogance, on his belief that he had finally broken her. And it depended on her own ability to walk into the lion's den, to face the men who had destroyed her life, and to hold her nerve, to be the bait in the most dangerous trap she had ever set. As dawn broke, casting a pale, gray light over the plains, Clara rode out of the mountains. She was not the avenging widow anymore. She was a sacrifice, a lone rider on a desperate, and perhaps final, ride to uphold a hunter's code that had been passed on to her by the men she had loved and lost. The ride from the high mesas back to Willow Creek was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every landmark, every turn in the trail, was steeped in a memory of a life that felt as if it belonged to another person. Clara rode through the pale, pre-dawn light, a solitary figure moving through a world of her own making, her husband's Winchester rifle now wrapped in a blanket and tied to her saddle, her own gun belt conspicuously, unnervingly, empty. This act of disarming herself was the most difficult thing she had ever done. The cold peacemaker had become a part of her, an extension of her will, a cold, hard substitute for the heart that had been carved out of her. To ride without it was to be naked, vulnerable, a feeling she had sworn she would never experience again. Her mind, however, was anything but empty. It was a razor-sharp instrument of calculation, running through the intricate, desperate plan she and James had devised. The plan was a symphony of timing and trust, a gamble with a dozen moving parts, any one of which could fail with catastrophic consequences. James and Silas, with their 10 fighters, were already moving to silent, flanking columns that were, at that very moment, slipping into the sleeping town of Willow Creek, becoming ghosts in Clara's old home. Their job was to turn the town from a stage for an execution into a perfectly calibrated death trap. Clara's role was the most dangerous of all. She was the bait. She was the sacrificial lamb, walking willingly into the wolf's den. Her objective was not just to present herself for surrender, but to control the time and place of the final confrontation, to hold Marcus Thorne's attention, to play on his ego and his arrogance long enough for James and Silas to spring their trap. As she crested the last rise and saw the familiar, sleepy shape of Willow Creek nestled in the valley below, a wave of profound, aching sorrow washed over her. This was the place she had once called home, the place where she had been happier than she had ever thought possible. Now, it was a prison, and she was riding back to it to either liberate it or to die in its streets. She timed her arrival for the exact moment of sunrise. She rode slowly down the main street, the clip-clop of her horse's hooves the only sound in the naturally silent town. The townsfolk were at their windows, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a terrible shame-pity. They saw not a warrior, but a lone, unarmed woman, riding to her doom to save them. In the center of the town, in the small, dusty plaza in front of the church, Marcus Thorne was waiting. He was not alone. He was flanked by the dozen remaining members of his gang, a hard-faced gallery of killers. The 6 hostages, their hands bound, their faces grim, were lined up against the church wall, a human shield. Thorne himself sat on his horse, a picture of triumphant, arrogant power, a cruel, satisfied smile on his face. "So, the widow comes to heel," he called out, his voice booming in the quiet morning air. "I must admit, Dawson, I am disappointed. I thought you had more fight in you." Clara reined in her horse, her face a calm and readable mask. "The fight is not with you, Thorne," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It is with the innocent men you are hiding behind. Let them go, and I am yours. All in due time," he sneered. "First, a demonstration of your good faith. Get off the horse." Slowly, she dismounted, her movements deliberate, her hands held open and away from her body. She was now completely vulnerable, a lone woman on foot, surrounded by a dozen armed and battle-hardened outlaws. She had played her first card. She was the bait, and the hook was set. Now, all she could do was wait, and pray that her friends, her army of the damned, were in position, and that their timing was as perfect as their courage. The long ride was over. The final, desperate stand was about to begin. The air in the Willow Creek Plaza was as tight as a coiled spring, thick with unspoken promise of violence. Marcus Thorne savored his moment of triumph, his gaze lingering on Clara, a predator enjoying the sight of its finely cornered prey. He had won. The woman who had humiliated him, who had haunted his every move, was now standing before him, disarmed and defeated. He had broken her. "You see, widow," he said, his voice a low, gloating drawl, "in the end, sentiment is always a weakness. Your love for these pathetic sodbusters, it is your undoing. A lesson your husband never learned either." Clara did not respond. Her face remained a calm, impassive mask, but inside, her mind was a whirlwind of cold, precise calculation. She was watching the sun, its rays just beginning to creep over the rooftops of the buildings on the east side of the street. She was watching the shadow of the church steeple, its slow, inexorable creep across the dusty plaza. She was counting the seconds, her entire being focused on the single, critical moment when the trap would be sprung. Thorne, growing impatient with her silence, decided to escalate the drama. He dismounted and strode toward her, his spurs ringing a death knell in the dust. "Before we conclude our business," he said, "there is the matter of my gold. The gold you stole from me at Mesa Roja. Where is it?" "It's gone," Clara replied, her voice flat. "It was used to buy food and medicine for the people you have been terrorizing." Thorne's face, for a moment, contorted in a mask of pure fury. The loss of the gold was a wound to his pride that still festered. He raised a hand and backhanded her across the face, the sound a sharp, ugly crack in the silent plaza. "Wrong answer," he hissed. Clara staggered from the blow, the taste of blood in her mouth. But as she looked up, her eyes were not filled with fear or pain. They were filled with a cold, triumphant light. The shadow of the church steeple had just touched the edge of the town's watering trough. It was the signal. She did the last thing Thorne, or anyone, would have expected. She smiled. "No, Thorne," she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. It was the right answer. And then, the town of Willow Creek, which had been a silent, terrified witness, erupted into a perfectly coordinated symphony of chaos. It did not begin with a gunshot. It began with an explosion. A massive, deafening blast from the west end of town, where Silas, the demolitions expert, had planted a charge that sent a derelict, abandoned wagon hurtling 100 feet into the air. It was a pure, spectacular diversion, designed to draw the eye. As every outlaw instinctively turned toward the sound of the explosion, the real attack began. From the rooftop of the general store, from the second-story windows of the hotel, from the dark, shadowy interiors of the livery stable, a dozen rifles opened up. It was not a wild, panicked volley. It was a disciplined, coordinated crossfire, every shot aimed, every target chosen. James and his men, who had infiltrated the town under the cover of darkness, had turned the entire plaza into a killing field. The Iron Spurs, caught completely in the open, were decimated in the first 10 seconds. They were professional gunfighters, but they were facing an enemy they could not see, an enemy who was everywhere at once. Horses screamed and fell. Men were knocked from their saddles, their surprised cries cut short by the steady, relentless fire from the surrounding buildings. Thorne, in that first, critical moment of chaos, was a man paralyzed by disbelief. His perfect, triumphant execution had become a perfectly executed ambush. He saw his men falling around him. He saw the hostages, and a prearranged move, drop to the ground and crawl for the safety of the church. He saw the entire town transform from a passive stage into an active, hostile combatant. He spun around, his pistol in his hand, looking for the architect of his demise. He saw Clara, no longer the unarmed victim, but a warrior. In the confusion, one of her men, hidden in the church itself, had tossed her a gun belt. She now stood, her husband's Colt in her hand, her face a mask of cold, beautiful, and terrible fury. Thorne fired, his shot wild with rage and panic. Clara returned fire, her shot not wild, but calm, steady, and true. It did not hit him. It struck the gun from his hand, sending it spinning into the dust. The battle for the plaza was over in less than a minute. The mighty Iron Spurs gang was a shattered, bleeding ruin. The few who were not dead were wounded, their will to fight utterly broken. But the war was not over. Thorne, his face a mask of primal, cornered animal terror, turned and fled. He ran, not toward his men, but toward the one place he thought he could find a final, defensible position, the town's large, stone-walled blacksmith shop. The very forge that Clara Dawson had once called home. He was a serpent, retreating into the one place he knew she would have to come to face him, alone. The blacksmith shop was a place of elemental power, a sanctuary of fire and steel. It had been Clara's refuge, the place where she had hammered her grief into a weapon. Now, it had become the stage for her final confrontation, a dark, smoke-filled arena where her war, and perhaps her life, would come to an end. She did not hesitate. She waved off James and Silas, who had rushed to her side. "This is my fight," she said, her voice a low, final thing. "This is between him and me." She walked toward the blacksmith shop, her husband's Colt a heavy, familiar weight in her hand. The town, which had erupted in a symphony of violence, now fell into a profound, expectant silence. The entire community, the people she had fought and bled for, stood as silent witnesses. She kicked the door of the forge open and stepped inside. The interior was a cavern of shadows and dying light, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. The forge itself was cold, its great, brick heart dormant. Marcus Thorne stood at the far end of the room, near the great anvil, wounded, desperate animal backed into a corner. He had found another pistol, a small derringer he had kept hidden in his boot. So, The little widow comes to finish the job herself, he snarled, his voice a ragged, breathless thing. Come to claim your pound of flesh. I've come for my husband's life, Thorn, she replied, her own voice calm, her footsteps slow and steady as she advanced into the room. The one you took from him, and the one you stole from me. He was a fool, Thorn screamed, his composure finally, completely shattering. A sentimental fool who thought he could live in this world with honor. This world doesn't reward honor, girl. It rewards strength. It rewards the will to take what you want. I am a wolf. He was a sheep. The wolf always eats the sheep. You're not a wolf, Thorn, she said, her voice as cold as quenched steel. You're a scavenger. A hyena that preys on the unsuspecting. A wolf has courage. You are just a coward. The word coward was the final insult, the one thing his tattered ego could not abide. With a roar of pure, nihilistic rage, he raised the derringer and fired. The shot was wild, the small caliber bullet whining past her head and burying itself in the heavy timber of the doorframe behind her. Clara did not fire back. She kept walking, her pace steady, her eyes locked on his, her own gun still held at her side. Her calmness, her refusal to be baited into a gunfight, was a more potent weapon than any bullet. It unnerved him, unraveled him. He fired again, his hand trembling, the shot going even wider this time. He was a man coming apart at the seams, his facade of strength and control dissolving into a pathetic, desperate panic. She was 10 feet from him now. She stopped. You had a choice, Thorn, she said, her voice a soft, almost sorrowful whisper. You could have been a man, but you chose to be a monster. And monsters have to be put down. She raised her gun. Their eyes met for a final, terrible moment. She saw in his not the face of a wolf, but the face of a frightened, pathetic man, a man who had built his life on the suffering of others, and was now utterly, completely alone with the consequences of his own evil. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. It was not a sound of rage. It was a sound of finality. A full stop at the end of a long and bloody sentence. Marcus Thorn staggered back, a look of profound, ultimate surprise on his face. He looked down at the small, dark hole that had appeared in his chest, then back up at her. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He fell, his body crashing against the great, solid anvil, the place where Clara had forged her new life, now the tombstone for the man who had destroyed her old one. She stood in the silence, the smoke from her pistol curling in the air. It was over. The hunt was finished. The debt was paid. She looked down at the man who had taken everything from her, and she felt nothing. The fire of her vengeance, which had burned so hot and so bright, had finally consumed its fuel. And in its place, there was only a vast, cold, and quiet emptiness. The silence in the forge was broken by the sound of footsteps. James and Silas stood in the doorway, their faces a mixture of relief and a deep, somber respect. They looked at the body of Marcus Thorn, then at Clara, who stood like a statue, her face a pale, unreadable mask, the gun still held loosely in her hand. It's over, Clara, James said, his voice gentle. She did not seem to hear him. She was staring at the man she had just killed, at the final, empty conclusion to her long and bloody quest. The great, driving purpose that had been the center of her universe for the past year was gone. And she was a ship without a rudder, adrift on a silent, empty sea. In the days that followed, the town of Willow Creek began the slow, difficult process of healing. With the Iron Spurs gang either dead or in chains, a fragile peace settled over the valley. The hostages were freed, the stolen money was recovered, and the townspeople, for the first time in a long time, could walk their own streets without fear. Clara was their hero, their savior. They tried to thank her, to celebrate her. But she was a ghost at her own victory party. She retreated into a profound, shell-shocked silence, the emptiness inside her wound far deeper than any bullet could have made. She had been the hunter of the hunted, a woman defined by her purpose. Now, with that purpose fulfilled, she did not know who she was. She spent her days in the forge, but not working. She would just sit there, in the cold, silent room, staring at the anvil where Thorn had fallen, a woman haunted not by her enemies, but by her own victory. It was her small army of the damned who, in the end, saved her. They were broken men, but they understood her brokenness. Silas, the one-armed prospector, would come and sit with her, not speaking, just sharing the silence, his quiet, steady presence a comforting anchor. It was James, the disgraced deputy, who finally broke through her wall of silence. He came to the forge one evening, not as a gunfighter, but as a lawman. He held a new, shiny, silver star in his hand. The town council had a meeting, he said, his voice quiet. They've offered me the job. Marshal of Willow Creek. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, earnest sincerity. I can't do it alone, Clara. This town, it needs more than just a lawman. It needs a conscience. It needs a heart. It needs you. I am not a hero, James, she whispered, her voice a dry and used thing. I am a killer. You are a survivor, he replied. And you are the reason this town has a future. You fought for a past you had lost. Now, you have to fight for a future you have earned. His words, simple and true, were a key, unlocking a door in the prison of her own grief. She looked around the forge, at the tools of her husband's trade, at the place where she had reforged herself. And she began to see a different path forward. She had been a woman defined by an ending. Perhaps, now, she could be a woman defined by a beginning. Her first act was a personal one. She took her husband's guns, the Colt and the Winchester, and she buried them, deep in the earth, under the shade of the great willow tree by the creek where he had first proposed to her. It was a final goodbye, a letting go of the ghost of her vengeance. Her second act was a public one. She did not accept a position on the council. She did not become a low woman. She did what she had always done. She fired up her forge. But she was not making weapons anymore. She was making plowshares. She was beating the swords of their violent past into the tools of their hopeful future. Years passed. The raw, violent story of the widow of Willow Creek faded, as all stories do, into the softer, warmer realm of legend. The town of Willow Creek, under the steady, combined leadership of Marshal James and the quiet, guiding hand of Clara Dawson, thrived. It did not become a rich town, not a boom town. It became something far rarer, and far more precious, a decent town. A place of hard work, of second chances, of a community that had been forged in fire and had emerged stronger, and more compassionate, for it. Clara Dawson never again picked up a gun. Her war was over. She found her peace not in the satisfying finality of a bullet, but in the slow, difficult, and deeply satisfying work of creation. She was the town's blacksmith, its heart, its soul. She took in apprentices, teaching the town's youth not just the art of shaping steel, but the value of hard work, of integrity, of building something that lasts. She and James never married. Theirs was a bond that went deeper than that. They were partners, two scarred but unbroken survivors who had found in each other a shared purpose and a quiet, profound companionship. They were the twin pillars upon which the new Willow Creek was built. The story ends on a warm, summer evening, 10 years after the battle in the plaza. Clara is no longer a young woman, but a woman in her prime, her face lined with the laughter and the wisdom of her hard-won peace. She is sitting on the porch of a new house, a house she designed and helped to build, a house that stands on the very spot where her old life had been burned to the ground. She is not alone. She is surrounded by the children of the town, her students from the small school she had helped to found. She is reading to them, not from a dime novel about gunfighters, but from a book of poetry. Her voice is calm, and strong, and full of a quiet, gentle beauty. Marshal James, his hair now mostly gray, his own face a testament to a life of service, comes and sits on the porch steps, listening, a quiet, contented smile on his face. As the sun sets, casting a long, golden light over the peaceful valley, a young girl, one of the orphans Clara has taken in, looks up at her. "Clara," the girl asks, her voice full of a child's innocent curiosity. "Is it true? The stories they tell? Were you really a hunter?" Clara closes the book and looks out at the town, at the homes, at the families, at the peaceful, thriving communities she has helped to build. She looks at the faces of the children, their eyes full of hope and the promise of a future that has been bought for them at a terrible price. A slow, gentle smile touches her lips. "Yes," she says, her voice a soft, quiet whisper. I was the hunter." She then reaches out and gently smooths the hair from the little girl's forehead. But I have learned that it is a far, far better thing to be a gardener. She had been a woman who was supposed to be broken, a victim of the West's casual brutality. But she had refused. She had become the hunter of the men who had hunted her. And in doing so, she had discovered a profound and lasting truth. The greatest victory is not in the taking of a life, but in the building of one. And the hunter's truest, and most lasting, legacy was not the graves she had filled, but the garden she had, against all odds, made to bloom in the dust.